Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're plunging into something, well, incredibly personal and fundamental to the human experience. These complex fears that can crop up around love and emotional connection.
That's right. And we're not just talking about, feeling awkward on a date or getting butterflies.
No, this is deeper.
Exactly. The sources we've looked at for this deep dive, they really focus on these deep-seated psychological things, experiences that can genuinely, significantly impact someone's life and their ability to form and keep meaningful relationships.
Right. We've waded through a bunch of material, articles, research that tries to define these fears, digs into some maybe surprising symptoms, traces where they might come from, and thankfully also points towards ways to heal.
Yeah, so our mission here really is to walk through what these sources are telling us. We want to help you, our listener, maybe understand what could be driving difficulties. Perhaps difficulties you've faced or someone you know when it comes to relationships.
And explore what steps the sources suggest can actually be taken.
Navigate those challenges.
Okay, let's unpack this then. The sources pinpoint a few specific fears that are, well, definitely more intense than just getting cold feet. First up, they talk about something called philophobia.
Philophobia, yeah, the name itself is interesting, right? Comes from the Greek philos, meaning love.
And phobia, fear.
Exactly. So at its heart, it's this fear of falling in love or even just forming those close emotional attachments.
And what really jumped out at me from the sources was how they described it. It's not just like avoiding love, but the actual feeling of romance can feel like an enemy.
Yeah, that phrasing really captures the intensity, doesn't it? It's this internal battle where those normally positive feelings, the ones associated with love, are actually perceived as a threat.
Wow.
And that often leads people to, actively steer clear of situations where they might even start to feel those things.
Okay, then there's another fear, closely related but maybe framed a bit differently. The fear of commitment.
This one's described as intense anxiety or a really significant fear specifically tied to the idea of entering a serious long-term thing, making that formal commitment to someone.
And the sources show this often plays out with people either avoiding relationships altogether,
right,
or, and this seems pretty common, pulling away suddenly, sharply, just as things start to get serious or feel exclusive.
Yeah, that pulling back mechanism is a key sign. Then the third big one discussed is the fear of abandonment. The material describes this as intense tension, a really pervasive fear of loneliness, and this persistent feeling that the people you're close to might just leave at any moment.
Sounds like it could be like a specific phobia trigger or maybe more of a constant background hum of anxiety.
Exactly. It can present either way as a distinct phobia or as that more chronic state of anxiety that just colors all your interactions within relationships.
Okay, so what's really insightful from these sources is digging into the why. Where do these things actually come from? The material seems to point really heavily towards our personal histories.
Oh, absolutely. The story of a person's life, especially the early parts, seems crucial. Past painful experiences in relationships, that's definitely a major factor.
Makes sense.
Things like going through intense heartbreak, experiencing betrayal, or even just a really difficult, messy breakup, they can leave deep emotional scars.
It's like your mind just builds these walls, right, to stop you from ever feeling that specific pain again.
Precisely, a defense mechanism. But the sources also really emphasize something even more foundational, going further back.
Yeah.
They really highlight the huge role of early life, childhood experiences, things like trauma, loss, parental divorce, death of a caregiver, or even just not having that consistent, warm, safe physical or emotional care. That can be a major, major contributor to fear of abandonment and problems with attachment later on.
And it's important, like the sources point out, this isn't always about, big dramatic abuse or neglect. Emotional abandonment in childhood. That can look much quieter.
That's a great point.
Like maybe not being allowed to express your feelings or being constantly belittled or even treated like a mini adult with responsibilities you just couldn't handle.
Yes, that distinction is so important. When a child doesn't get that reliable, safe, emotional presence, it can sort of hardwire this chronic insecurity, this fear that just follows them into adulthood, making it incredibly hard to form secure attachments.
The sources also link these fears to how we see ourselves. Right. Like if someone struggles with low self-confidence or has this core belief that they're somehow not good enough, how does that fit in?
Well, that can directly feed into a fear of commitment because deep down they might feel unworthy of a serious, lasting relationship.
Yeah.
They might think, why would anyone really commit to me? Eventually they'll see I'm not worth it.
Yeah. And here's something that kind of surprised me in the sources. Even having unrealistically high expectations for relationships or partners can feed into this fear of commitment.
Yes, that really stood out to me too. It's almost like holding on to an ideal that's so perfect, so high,
Yeah.
that the anxiety of maybe never finding it or maybe not being able to be the person needed for that ideal relationship just stops you from even trying. It paralyzes you.
The fear of the unknown comes up too, right? And just change in general.
It does. That fear of losing your personal freedom, your independence, may be combined with just a general unease about change and the responsibilities that a shared future might bring. That can definitely fuel a fear of commitment.
Yeah, okay, less detail in our sources on these, but they do briefly mention things like external pressures, society saying you should settle down.
Societal expectations. And they even touch on potential genetic factors, like a predisposition to anxiety, or maybe a family history of anxiety disorders playing a role.
And how these fears can kind of overlap with other anxieties, like fear of rejection, or even a specific fear about marriage itself.
Yeah, it just highlights how interconnected all these psychological states can be. It's rarely just one thing in isolation.
Okay, so we've looked at the what, the different fears, and the why, the potential roots. Now let's get into the how. How do these fears actually show up? What does it look like when someone's living with this stuff?
Well, the symptoms and behaviors can be pretty varied. On the psychological and emotional side, you see intense anxiety, sometimes tipping over into panic attacks, active efforts to suppress or numb emotions, kind of shutting down, and just constant worry about relationships, their future, the possibility they might end.
And the sources describe specific behaviors that come from that, right?
Yeah.
Like actively avoiding places where couples hang out, parks, movies, weddings.
Yeah, avoiding triggers, preferring isolation over potentially connecting with someone, sometimes just completely canceling the idea of marriage from their life plan.
And just generally having this really negative view of relationships.
A deeply negative outlook, yes. And then there are the physical reactions, which are very real.
Okay.
In situations that involve romantic feelings or emotional closeness, people might experience, a racing heart, trouble breathing, sweating, feeling sick.
Nausea, dizziness.
Dizziness, trembling. And in really severe cases, even feeling faint. The body is literally reacting as if there's a clear and present danger.
That's intense. And how does all this impact actual behavior in a relationship, whether it's just starting or already established?
Oh, significantly. The fear can drive people to push others away, sometimes ending relationships really abruptly, maybe without giving a reason that makes sense to the other person.
Yeah.
They might also shy away from emotional vulnerability, deep talks, or physical intimacy.
And for that fear of abandonment specifically, the sources seem to lay out a whole pattern of behaviors. They mention needing constant reassurance.
Yes, a constant need for validation from the partner. Intense jealousy can be part of it. Difficulty trusting their partner's motives or intentions.
Just feeling insecure all the time.
A pervasive sense of insecurity, yeah. Engaging in people-pleasing, maybe overgiving, trying desperately to make sure the person won't leave.
Wow.
Struggles with control too, either needing to control the partner or feeling controlled by them. And sadly, sometimes it means staying in relationships that are clearly unhealthy, even toxic.
Just because being alone feels even scarier.
Exactly. The fear of being alone is overwhelming.
And the sources make this really crucial point about how a bad past relationship can almost write a script for self-sabotage in new ones.
Yes, it's like this negative feedback loop. The past hurt programs you to expect more hurt in the future,
Right.
which then leads to behaviors like constantly finding flaws in your current partner, being overly critical, keeping an emotional distance, or just a general lack of trust. And unfortunately, those behaviors can then create the very relationship problems you were afraid of in the first place.
Oof, that pattern.
Yeah.
Past pain creating current patterns that just reinforce the original fear. That's a powerful insight from these sources.
It really is. And it highlights how much of this operates on an unconscious level. These defenses just kick in automatically.
Which brings us nicely to the psychology behind why the mind uses these patterns and defenses. The sources introduce some key ideas here, starting with psychic complexes.
Right. The sources describe these as these deeply rooted, almost distorted ways of thinking and feeling. They're not just moods, they're more like unconscious maps in our psyche.
The maps.
Yeah, maps that really shape how a person sees themselves, how they see others, how they interact with the world.
So someone might develop, say, an abandonment complex, where everything is filtered through that fear of being left.
Exactly. Or maybe a love complex where there's this desperate, perhaps unhealthy need to be loved to get external validation. These aren't just surface thoughts, they're like fundamental internal structures guiding behavior.
Okay, I think I get that.
Yeah.
And alongside complexes, the sources talk about defense mechanisms.
These are the mind's unconscious tools. It's automatic shields, basically, designed to protect the self from the tension and anxiety caused by difficult thoughts, feelings, or situations.
So they're trying to help us cope when things feel overwhelming or threatening.
That's the intention, yes. Though, as the sources point out, sometimes these strategies end up being unhelpful or even damaging in the long run.
Right.
They list a whole range of them, from less mature ones, like just avoiding problems altogether, escaping into fantasy, using passive aggression.
Or projecting your own unwanted feelings onto someone else.
Yes, projection is a big one. All the way to more mature mechanisms where maybe you redirect negative energy into something positive like work or creativity, or you consciously decide, okay, I'm going to put this stressful thought aside until I'm better equipped to deal with it.
So they're all attempts, conscious or not, to manage difficult internal states.
Precisely. Managing those overwhelming emotions and perceived threats.
It paints a pretty challenging picture, but the sources definitely offer hope. They talk about actionable steps, paths forward. How do they suggest addressing these fears?
Well, the absolute first step, according to basically all the sources, is awareness.
Just recognizing.
Recognizing the negative impact these fears are having on your life, on your relationships, and being really honest with yourself about them, that's crucial.
It's about taking that sometimes difficult step back to reflect. Trying to understand where this fear might be coming from. Is it pointing back to specific past trauma? Or is it more tied to negative thought patterns that have just built up over time?
Exactly. But for many people, especially if these symptoms have been around for a while, the sources often mention something like 6 months as a benchmark.
Yeah.
And if they're genuinely impacting daily life, then seeking professional help is presented as really essential. These are real psychological issues, and the good news is they can be treated.
So a specialist can properly assess the situation, right? Using interviews, maybe questionnaires, to really understand the specific way the fear shows up and its history. What kinds of therapy do the sources highlight as being helpful?
Several come up repeatedly as effective. Cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, is a common one.
Right, CBT.
The focus there is really on identifying and then directly challenging those negative thoughts and core beliefs that are fueling the fear. It helps people build more positive, more realistic ways of thinking about love, relationships, attachment.
Exposure therapy is also mentioned. That sounds intense.
It can be, but it's done very gradually and safely. It involves confronting the fear itself bit by bit. So for fear of commitment, maybe it starts really small, like just talking about the idea of commitment,
Okay.
and then slowly, safely, taking small steps towards allowing connections to deepen. For something like philophobia, the sources even suggested potentially exposing the person to romantic stories or scenes in a controlled way to help them process their reactions.
Interesting. What else?
Psychodynamic therapy is another approach mentioned. That one aims to dig deeper, often into the childhood roots of the fear, connecting present struggles with those formative past experiences.
Makes sense, given the origins we discussed.
And group therapy comes up too. That can offer a really valuable space, letting people connect with others who get it, who are facing similar challenges. It's a place to share feelings, practice social skills, build connection in a supportive setting.
And beyond formal therapy, the sources list quite a few other supports and coping strategies.
Yeah, definitely. Medication, like antidepressants or anti-anxiety meds, might be recommended by a professional if there's severe anxiety or depression alongside these fears.
Okay.
Support from trusted friends and family is consistently highlighted as really beneficial, just having people in your corner.
Absolutely. What about self-care type stuff?
Yes, focusing on self-care, getting into healthy daily routines, learning to set clear and healthy emotional boundaries in relationships. That's a big one.
Boundaries, yeah.
Developing calming responses for when those anxious thoughts or feelings hit. Actively building a supportive community, like a tribe, through shared interests or hobbies.
Finding your people.
Exactly. And crucially, the sources really emphasize working on self-confidence and building a solid sense of self-worth that isn't dependent on someone else's approval or whether they stay or go.
So if your value comes from within.
Right. If your sense of worth is internal, the fear of someone leaving, while still painful perhaps, loses some of its devastating power.
That makes a lot of sense. Finally, the sources seem to encourage embracing, well, a certain amount of vulnerability.
Yes. Understanding that, okay, there is a risk involved in opening up, but that vulnerability is actually fundamental if you want deep, meaningful connections.
You can't have one without the other, really.
Pretty much. It's about learning to choose partners carefully, absolutely, and giving relationships the time they need to build trust. But also accepting that the potential for pain is always there, you know? The message seems to be that while protecting yourself from real harm is vital, sometimes you have to be willing to take that calculated risk for the chance of experiencing something truly wonderful.
Okay, so to kind of wrap this up,
Yeah.
the sources really show us that these fears, fear of love, commitment, abandonment, they're pretty common, often deeply rooted challenges. And they can profoundly impact a person's ability to form and keep healthy relationships.
But, and this is the important part, they also make it incredibly clear that these fears don't have to be permanent roadblocks. There are real, tangible paths towards understanding yourself better, towards healing, through self-awareness, building those supportive connections, and getting professional guidance when it's needed.
So as you, our listener, think about everything we've dug into from the sources today, maybe consider this. Where does that instinct to protect yourself? Where might it cross the line into building walls that actually end up preventing you from experiencing the very connection you might deep down really desire? What could the story of your relationships look like if you approach them not just with caution, which is understandable, but also with courage and importantly with self-compassion?